I should say at the outset that this was not a case that came to Holmes. It was a case that came to me first, and that I very nearly did not bring to him at all, because when I first heard the woman's claim, I took it for the product of grief disordered by shock, the kind of thing a doctor encounters in the recently bereaved and knows, with practiced gentleness, to receive without entirely believing. I was at Scotland Yard on a Tuesday morning in September of 1896, having been asked by Lestrade to look at a set of medical records relevant to a separate inquiry. I arrived at 9:30 and was kept waiting in the corridor outside his office for the better part of 40 minutes, during which time I became unavoidably aware of the conversation taking place in the room adjacent to the waiting area. The door was not quite closed, and the woman's voice carried. She was saying, with the particular compressed patience of someone who has repeated themselves many times and is beginning to suspect they will have to repeat themselves many more, "I am not confused. I am not in shock. I understand what you think I am saying, and I understand why it seems impossible. What I am telling you is that my husband died in April of 1894, and my husband died again in August of 1896, and both times I identified the body myself. Both times the death was registered. And now I am sitting in this room telling you this, and you are looking at me the way you are looking at me, and I would like you to stop." There was a pause. Then a male voice, young, I thought, and uncertain. "Mrs. Hartley, the records show that your husband, Mr. Gerald Hartley, died on the 4th of April, 1894, in Dorset. His estate was settled. His death certificate, I know what his death certificate says. I also know what I saw 2 weeks ago in an inquest room in Southwark, where I was called to identify a body found in the Thames. I identified that body as my husband Gerald. I have now identified my husband's body twice, 2 years apart, in 2 different counties. I would like to know which of those identifications was wrong, and why, and who is responsible." I stopped pretending to read the documents in my hand. When Lestrade finally emerged to collect me, I told him, before he could say a word, that I needed 5 minutes with the woman in the next room. He gave me the look he always gives in such circumstances, the look that implies he suspects the situation is about to become considerably more complicated, and opened the door. Her name was Nora Hartley. She was perhaps 35, with dark auburn hair pulled back simply, and the kind of face that wears tiredness without being defeated by it. She was dressed well but not expensively, and she was sitting in the hard wooden chair across from the young constable with the upright, deliberate posture of someone who has decided that the best way to be taken seriously is to appear as though she has never doubted she would be. I introduced myself. She assessed me briefly, the way a person assesses a stranger when they are deciding how much energy to allocate to them. "Are you here to tell me I'm confused?" she asked. "No," I said. "I'm here because I was listening through the door, and what you're describing is medically impossible through any ordinary mechanism, which makes it interesting. My associate is the man you need." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Your associate being Sherlock Holmes. You've heard of him?" "I was married to a solicitor for 8 years, Dr. Watson. My husband's practice dealt extensively with insurance and estate matters." Mr. Holmes's name came up professionally on more than one occasion. A pause. "I'll come." Holmes received her in Baker Street that afternoon, and I was struck immediately by the difference in how she told the story when she was no longer performing it for a skeptical audience. In Lestrade's anteroom, she had been precise, defended, armored in the deliberate control of someone who knows they are not being believed. In our sitting room, with Holmes in the armchair opposite her and myself nearby with my notebook, she told it the way you tell something true without the scaffolding, without the rehearsed structure, with the occasional productive detour that a person allows themselves when they trust they will be followed. Gerald Hartley had been a solicitor with a practice in Dorset, specializing in wills, trusts, and estates. They had married in 1887, when Nora was 26 and Gerald was 31. The marriage had been, she paused here with the slight breath of a person selecting a word carefully functional. Not unhappy, but not the kind of marriage that fills a house with warmth. Gerald was a capable man and a reliable husband, and she had been, in the aggregate, grateful for both qualities. In the spring of 1894, Gerald had gone to London on business. He went frequently. It was a regular part of his practice. He had told her to expect him back within the week. Instead, on the 6th day, she received a telegram from the Metropolitan Police informing her that her husband had been found dead in a room at a boarding house in Islington. The cause of death was cardiac arrest. He had registered under his own name and had been identified by the boarding house proprietor. Nora had travelled to London and identified the body herself. It was Gerald, unambiguously, and she had said so. She had returned to Dorset. She had managed the estate, settled the practice, and rebuilt her life over the subsequent 2 years. Gerald had left her comfortably provided, for the house was fully hers. There were investments. The estate had been settled without complication. She had, by the time we met her, arrived at something like equilibrium. In August of 1896, a message came from a Southwark coroner's office requesting that she attend to identify a body. The body of a man of approximately 50 years of age, without identification, had been recovered from the Thames near London Bridge. In his jacket pocket had been a card bearing her name and Dorset address. The police had written to ask if she could assist in identifying the deceased. She had gone. She was not a woman who avoided things. The body on the Southwark table was her husband Gerald. "You are certain," Holmes said. It was not a challenge. He was noting a fact. "I was certain in 1894, and I am certain now," she said. He had a scar on his left forearm from a burn he received as a child, a long, narrow, pale scar that ran from his wrist to the inside of his elbow. The body in 1894 had that scar. The body in Southwark had that scar. I do not know a single other person who bears that particular mark in that particular place. Was there anything else distinctive about the body in Southwark? Any difference from the man you knew? He was older. He looked reduced, not just from death, but from whatever the years between had been. She was quiet for a moment. He had grown a beard, which he had never worn when we were married. And his hands, she stopped. His hands were different. Not the scar, not the general shape, but the condition of them. Gerald was a solicitor. His hands were the hands of a man who worked with papers. The hands on the Southwark body were harder, rougher, the hands of someone who had been doing work of a physical kind for 2 years. Holmes pressed his fingertips together. The 1894 death, the cardiac arrest in Islington. Was there a post-mortem examination? The coroner said one had been conducted and found nothing inconsistent with natural causes. The body was buried in Dorset, in the churchyard at Wareham. I chose the gravesite myself. Then one of two things is true, Holmes said. Either the body in Southwark is not your husband, despite your certainty that it is, and the shared scar has some other explanation. Or the body buried in Wareham in 1894 is not your husband, and the man you identified at the time was someone else, someone bearing, either by coincidence or by deliberate arrangement, the same distinctive scar. He paused. Which of these do you believe? Nora Hartley was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I believe Gerald faked his own death in 1894. I believe the body I identified in Islington was not Gerald, but someone else who had been prepared, in some way, to resemble him. I believe Gerald has been alive for the past 2 years, living under a different identity. And I believe that 2 weeks ago, whatever life he had built for himself came to an end, and he ended up in the Thames. Why do you believe this, rather than the alternative? Because of the hands, she said. The body in Islington had Gerald's hands exactly as they were a solicitor's hands, smooth and well kept. If that body were not Gerald, someone had gone to considerable trouble to replicate the scar. But nobody would think to roughen someone else's hands to match. The body in Southwark had the right scar and the wrong hands, which means the Southwark body lived a different life than Gerald Hartley. But it was Gerald. Holmes looked at her with an expression that I had rarely seen directed at a client in our years of practice together, genuine, undisguised respect. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, "I would like you to tell me everything you know about the state of Gerald's professional affairs in the months before he went to London in April of 1894. The picture she painted was, once you saw it, obvious in retrospect the way these pictures always are. But the components of it had been, at the time, distributed across enough separate conversations and observations that Nora had not assembled them into a single image, until she sat in Baker Street and Holmes asked her, with specific and patient precision, exactly the right questions. Gerald had been worried. This was the first thread. In the 6 months before his supposed death, he had been not anxious in an obvious or dramatic way, but preoccupied in the manner of a man running a continuous internal calculation. She had attributed it to professional pressures, which were real. His practice had taken on several complex trust matters in 1893, and the administration of one large estate in particular had been occupying him considerably. The estate was that of a man named Thomas Palliser, who had died in the autumn of 1893, leaving a moderately substantial fortune and a will of some complexity. Gerald had been Palliser's solicitor for years. The estate was to be divided between Palliser's 2 children, an adult son named Edmund and a daughter named Clara, who was married and living in Scotland. "What was complex about the will?" Holmes asked. "I never knew the details. Gerald was always scrupulous about client confidentiality, even at home." She paused. "But I do know that Edmund Palliser came to the house in Wareham on at least 3 occasions in those 6 months, and after each visit, Gerald was different, more preoccupied, quieter. Did you ever speak to Edmund Palliser?" "Once, briefly. He came to the door and I happened to answer it. He was perhaps 40. A large man, very certain of himself. The kind of man who fills a doorway and seems to expect this to be impressive." She stopped. "He looked at me as if I were a household feature, rather than a person. I disliked him immediately. And the daughter, Clara, I met her once, at a dinner that Gerald and I attended shortly after Mr. Palliser's death. She seemed worried. She asked Gerald a question during the meal that I was not meant to overhear about whether everything was in order, and he told her yes, everything was in order. But the way he said it was not the way a man says yes when the answer is actually yes." Holmes was quiet for a moment. I knew that look, the look of a man whose mind has just made a connection that changes the topography of everything around it. "Mrs. Hartley, when Gerald's estate was settled after his death in 1894, what happened to the Palliser matter? Who administered it after him?" "A colleague took it over. A man named Aldrington who practiced in Dorchester. I assumed the Palliser estate had already been settled by that time, but I never specifically asked. And Gerald's own finances. When you say he left you comfortably provided for, was the level of provision surprising to you?" "More than you would have expected from his practice." A longer pause. "I assumed it was from savings. He had always managed our finances. I trusted him to do so, and I did not examine the details closely." She looked at Holmes, directly. "Are you suggesting that the money was not his?" "I am suggesting that the money may have had a more complex origin than we presently know. I would like to examine Gerald's accounts, whatever records remain from the estate settlement." He rose. "There is also a grave in Wareham that will need to be looked at more carefully than it has been. And there is a man named Edmund Palliser, who I believe has information that he has not yet been asked the right questions about." Holmes had dealt with exhumations before. He disliked them not from any sentiment about the disturbance of the dead, but because they represented a kind of confirmation that could have been reached by cleaner means had all the right questions been asked at the beginning. "Exhumation," he once said, "is what happens when a coroner's inquest is conducted by someone more interested in arriving at a verdict than in establishing a fact. In this case, the inquest of 1894 had, by all appearances, been conducted with exactly that kind of impatient efficiency. The death certificate had been issued promptly. The body had been claimed promptly. The burial had followed. Nobody had looked closely because the widow had identified the body, and there was no reason to look closely, and the whole matter had been closed with the dispatch that bureaucracies apply to things that do not inconvenience them. The exhumation order took 4 days to obtain. Holmes spent those 4 days doing other things, visiting Dorset, speaking to 2 retired clerks from Gerald Hartley's practice, and conducting a prolonged private interview with Lestrade that I was not present for. When he returned from the Lestrade meeting, he was in a mood that I had learned to characterize as contained momentum, not the manic brightness of a case breaking open, but the focused, patient energy of a man who has identified the shape of the thing and is now methodically confirming the details. I accompanied him to Wareham for the exhumation. Nora Hartley did not attend, which Holmes had advised, and she had agreed to without resistance, a sign, I thought, of the particular composure she maintained throughout, not distance, but a refusal to let the procedural facts of the investigation replace the human ones. The churchyard was grey and still in the October morning. 2 gravediggers, the local police surgeon, a magistrate's representative, and Holmes and I. The grave marker was plain, Gerald Hartley, 1843 to 1894. The stone was already slightly weathered, which was a function of the particular damp stone they used in that part of Dorset, and not in itself significant. The coffin, when it was brought up, was in the condition one expects after 2.5 years in English soil, which is to say, not a condition I will describe in detail. Holmes, however, was not deterred. He had brought with him the specific items he needed and conducted his examination with the systematic thoroughness that characterized his work in all conditions where the facts were physical rather than testimonial. The scar was not there. The left forearm of the body in the coffin bore no scar at all, not the absence of a scar, not a scar in a slightly different position, but the entire, smooth, undisturbed skin of a man who had never been burned as a child. Holmes straightened. He looked at me. "Right," he said, with the particular quietness he affected when something confirmed his worst expectation. "Then Gerald Hartley is the man in the Southwark mortuary, and the man in this grave is someone else entirely. And Gerald Hartley staged his own death in April of 1894, using a body that had been obtained and prepared for the purpose." "Obtained," I said. The word sat heavily. "Yes, we will need to determine from where. But that is a secondary question at present. The primary question is who else knew, and what it is that Gerald Hartley was escaping from." The answer to the question of what Gerald Hartley had been escaping from came in layers, which is how such answers usually come when the person who built the original situation took care with its construction. The first layer was the Palliser estate. Holmes spent a day in Dorchester examining the records of the estate settlement, as they had been completed by the colleague, Aldrington, who had taken over after Hartley's supposed death. He also spoke to Clara Palliser's husband, who lived in Edinburgh, and made the journey south, in response to Holmes's telegram, a journey he undertook with a willingness that suggested he had been waiting for someone to ask. The Palliser estate had been worth, at the time of Thomas Palliser's death in 1893, approximately £22,000 in investments and property. By the time the estate was formally settled in mid-1894, it had been worth £14,000. The difference had not, as one might expect, gone to creditors or into legal costs. It had simply redistributed across a series of transfers and transactions that the settlement documents rendered as normal practice, but which, to Holmes's eye, formed a pattern. Hartley was moving money. Holmes told me that evening, back at Baker Street, with the documents spread across his desk. Not stealing it outright, nothing so crude. Moving it. Pieces of the Palliser investments were being liquidated and the proceeds directed to accounts that were nominally part of the estate administration, but were, in practice, controlled by someone outside the estate. He traced a finger across a column of figures. This kind of manipulation is very difficult to detect if nobody is looking for it specifically. It looks, to any ordinary review, like normal estate management. The money moves through legitimate appearing channels. By the time the estate is settled, The reduced figure looks like the result of management fees, legal costs, market fluctuations. The beneficiaries receive less than they should, but they receive it through a process that appears above board, and most people do not know enough about estate administration to recognize that it isn't. But someone did know. Edmund Palliser knew, or suspected. That is why he came to Wareham 3 times in those 6 months, not to threaten Hartley, I think, but because he was a beneficiary of the diversion. Hartley was not acting alone. The money was not going into Hartley's own accounts, or at least not primarily. He set the documents down. It was going somewhere else, and Edmund Palliser knew where. Was Hartley being coerced? That is what I do not yet know. He may have been a willing participant. He may have been in a position where refusal was not a practical option. The distinction matters both morally and for understanding why he chose to disappear, rather than expose whoever was directing him. And the body in the grave. The man who was buried in Hartley's place. Holmes was quiet for a moment. A man of approximately the right age and build, with no identifying marks, and no apparent family or connections who would report him missing. There were, in 1894, several categories of person fitting that description readily available in London. I have people making inquiries. He paused. It is not a pleasant aspect of the case, but it is a necessary one. I thought of Nora Hartley's words. Someone had been prepared to resemble him. Even at the time, the phrase had struck me as both precise and terrible. On the 5th day of the investigation, Nora Hartley came back to Baker Street uninvited. She arrived in the early afternoon, and when Mrs. Hudson brought her up, she had the look of a woman who has been sitting with something uncomfortable and has finally decided that the only relief is to say it aloud. Holmes offered her tea, which she accepted, and then waited. "There is something I didn't tell you," she said. "Not because I was hiding it deliberately, because I wasn't sure it was relevant, and because it reflects badly on me." "Tell me now," Holmes said, without any particular inflection of judgment. "In the summer of 1893, several months before Gerald went to London, and before any of this, I found, in Gerald's desk, a letter. I should not have been in his desk. I was looking for a document related to the house insurance, which he said he had filed there. I found the insurance document, and I found the letter. What did the letter say? It was from a man whose name I did not recognize at the time I recognize it now, after what you have told me. The name was Palliser, Edmund Palliser. It was brief. It said," she paused. Recalling it, it said, "The arrangement as discussed. The Dorset account will receive the first transfer before the end of the month. Do not contact me at this address again. Destroy this." Gerald had not destroyed it. No. I put it back exactly where I found it and said nothing. I told myself it was routine business correspondence, that I had misunderstood the tone, that there was an innocent explanation. She held Holmes's gaze steadily. I was lying to myself. I understood perfectly well that it was not routine. But we were not the kind of married couple who discussed things of that nature, and I was comfortable, in a material sense. And I was afraid that if I pressed on it, the comfortable life would turn out to have been built on something I didn't want to know about. And so you didn't ask. And so I didn't ask. 3 years later, Gerald was dead, or we thought he was, and the estate was settled and the comfortable life was still there, and I convinced myself that whatever it had been was also dead and buried with him. A short pause, and then he turned up in the Thames. Holmes studied her with that expression that is not unkind but is absolutely without softening. "Mrs. Hartley, I want to be clear about the significance of what you have just told me. The money that you inherited from Gerald's estate, the comfortable provision he made for you, almost certainly contains funds that were diverted from the Palliser estate and possibly from other estates managed in a similar fashion over Gerald's career. This is not a comfortable fact. No, it is not. It may have implications for you, depending on what the investigation ultimately establishes. You may be required to return a portion of that inheritance. I know." She was quiet for a moment. When I went to Scotland Yard, I was not expecting to unravel all of this. I went because I saw my husband's body, and I wanted to know which of the two deaths was real, and why. I still want to know that. Whatever the rest of it costs, I want to know the truth of it. She looked at Holmes directly. Can you find out who killed him? Because I do not believe he drowned accidentally. I believe whoever he was working with or for decided he had become a liability. Yes, Holmes said. That is also my belief. Then find them. The money, whatever needs to happen with the money will happen, but find them. The inquiries Holmes had set in motion about the body in the Wareham grave produced results on the 7th day, and the results were exactly as unpleasant as their nature suggested they would be. His contact, a man of wide and unremarked connections in the criminal geography of London, had identified a pattern. In the winter and spring of 1894, 3 men of middle age, without family connections, had been reported missing from lodging houses in the Whitechapel and Bermondsey areas. None of the 3 disappearances had been investigated with any seriousness. Men of that category went missing with sufficient regularity that the police allocated minimal resources to finding them. But 2 of the 3 had been seen, within the week before their disappearance, in the company of a man whose description matched that of a known associate of Edmund Palliser. The 3rd had been identified as having once worked, briefly, as a clerk in an office whose premises Palliser had at some point leased for business purposes. One of the 3, a man named Grover, a former printer's compositor who had fallen into irregular employment and irregular lodgings some years before his disappearance, had been, by the account of a former landlady, a man of approximately 50, heavy-set, with a fading scar on his left forearm from an accident in a press room. I read this and felt, as I occasionally did in the darkest cases Holmes and I investigated together, a certain weight settling that had nothing to do with logic. Holmes read it twice, and then set it aside with the particular deliberateness of a man putting something in a specific place in his mind where it would be available when needed. Edmund Palliser, he said. He is the node. Everything connects through him. The diversion of the estate funds, the arrangement with Hartley, the man in the grave, and I believe Hartley's death 2 weeks ago. He picked up his pipe. What I do not yet know is the full extent of the operation Palliser was running. Hartley was one solicitor, one set of estates. A man of Palliser's apparent resources and methodical temperament does not build this kind of arrangement around a single solicitor. There are others. Other solicitors? Other estates? Other victims of this specific kind of fraud. The mechanism is elegant. In a repellent way, you need a solicitor with access to trust and estate accounts, an arrangement by which the diverted funds are absorbed into legitimate-looking transfers, and a beneficiary class that is either unsophisticated or in a sufficiently weak position to be unable to challenge the reduced settlement. He set his pipe down unlit. Clara Palliser received less than half of what her father intended her to receive. She knew something was wrong but had no proof and no means to pursue it. How many Clara Pallisers are there? You think this is larger than one estate? I think Gerald Hartley staged an elaborate and costly death in April of 1894, and that doing so required resources, the body, the preparation, the logistics of disappearing into a new identity. Resources of that kind come from somewhere, and they suggest that whatever Hartley was escaping from was substantial enough to justify spending whatever it took to escape it. He stood. I need to speak with Edmund Palliser, and I need to do it in a way that does not give him advance notice that the conversation is coming. Edmund Palliser lived in a house in Mayfair that announced its occupant's sense of himself without subtlety. It was large, well-maintained, and decorated in a style that might be described as aggressively confident, the home of a man who had decided what he wanted to project and had spent considerable money doing so. He received Holmes on the pretext of a matter connected to a charitable trust, which Holmes had arranged through a mutual acquaintance with sufficient plausibility to get through the door. I accompanied Holmes, at his insistence, though I was uncertain what specific function I served. I have come to understand, over the years, that Holmes sometimes brings me to interviews not because he needs a second set of observations, but because my presence changes the dynamic of the room in ways he finds useful. I have never been entirely sure whether this is a compliment to my character or simply a calculation about how people respond to a doctor's face. Palliser was exactly as Nora Hartley had described, a large man, certain of himself, with the kind of physical authority that people of that type mistake for intelligence. He was 53 or 54, with grey at the temples and the particular well-fed solidity of someone who has never seriously worried about money. He received Holmes with the wariness of a man who is always slightly watchful and has learned to conceal it beneath a layer of expansive confidence. Holmes's approach was, as it frequently was with this type, indirect. He spent the first 10 minutes discussing the charitable trust with apparent genuine interest, which was an impressive performance because neither the trust nor the discussion was real. He established, over these 10 minutes, a conversational register of collegial interest that relaxed Palliser by degrees, as Holmes intended. Then, gradually and without any visible shift in approach, Holmes steered the conversation toward estate administration, inheritance law, the complexities of trust management. He spoke as a man of some knowledge, which he was, and Palliser engaged with the subject it was clearly one he was comfortable with, which was itself informative. And then, your father's estate settled in '94, if I recall. That must have been a complex matter given the scale. A fractional pause. Not especially. Hartley managed it capably, as he always had. Hartley. He died shortly after settling it, didn't he? Something of a coincidence. Cardiac arrest, Palliser said. Terrible thing. He was not an old man. And the estate itself, were you satisfied with the settlement? These things can be contentious with multiple beneficiaries. Clara and I were both satisfied. The voice was level, but there was something underneath it now, a careful, managed quality that had not been present in the casual first part of the conversation. My sister is a straightforward person. We had no disagreements. Splendid. And the investments, the estate was fairly substantial, as I understand. Well managed, by all accounts. My father was a prudent man. Holmes smiled pleasantly and moved on, and the conversation returned to the charitable trust and remained there until we left. In the street outside, I asked what he had learned. Palliser knew Hartley was dead. Not merely in the abstract, he knew it specifically. When I mentioned Hartley, he did not ask how I knew him or what connection I had to him. He placed the name immediately, in the correct context, and he gave me the cause of death without my asking for it. The response was practiced. He has given that particular response before. He knows about the Southwark body. He knows, or has been told, that the man he believed was living quietly in a new identity somewhere in England turned up in the Thames. And he knows I am aware of Hartley. That means, Watson, that we have perhaps 2 or 3 days before he begins moving whatever needs to be moved. He turned up his collar against the sharp October wind. We are going to need Lestrade, and we are going to need him quickly. Before Holmes could complete the case, there was a piece missing the 2 years of Gerald Hartley's life between April 1894 and August 1896. Who he had been, how he had lived, how he had ended in the Thames. Without this, the case against Palliser was incomplete in the human sense, even if it could be made legally sufficient. Holmes found it through a combination of methods that I will not detail fully, because several of them touched on the private lives of people who were not themselves guilty of anything and who had not asked to be part of this story. What I can say is that within 4 days of the visit to Palliser's house, Holmes had reconstructed the outline of Gerald Hartley's 2-year disappearance with sufficient confidence to present it to Nora Hartley in our sitting room, with the quiet, careful delivery he brought to the moments when the facts he was giving someone were facts they had asked for, but would not find comfortable. Gerald Hartley had left England in May of 1894, a month after his supposed death, travelling under a name that Holmes had identified but which, for reasons of privacy, I will not record here. He had gone first to the continent, then to South America, then back to the continent, following a route that suggested someone who is simultaneously trying to put distance between himself and the past while being uncertain where to go. He had eventually settled in Lisbon for approximately a year. In late 1895, he had returned to England. Holmes believed this decision, the return, was the turning point. The life abroad had not been sustaining. Whatever Gerald Hartley had been, he had been English, and the life of someone using a false identity in a country not his own had, apparently, not provided the peace he had sought when he staged his death. He had returned under a different name and taken lodgings in Southwark. He had found work, physical work, as the condition of his hands confirmed, in a warehouse near the docks. He had lived quietly, as far as Holmes could establish, for approximately 10 months. And then something had changed. The something was Edmund Palliser. Whether Palliser had found Hartley or Hartley had contacted Palliser, Holmes could not determine with certainty. What he had established was that in June of 1896, 2 months before the body was found in the Thames, there had been contact between the two men. A letter had been sent to an address in Southwark, not Hartley's lodging address, but a receiving address used by several people in handwriting that matched correspondence Holmes had obtained from Palliser's business dealings. He found him, Nora Hartley said. It was not a question. Or Hartley made the contact himself. If Hartley had been living on warehouse wages for 10 months, having spent whatever he had accumulated during the years abroad, he may have decided that the original arrangement was preferable to destitution. He may have tried to resume the relationship with Palliser. He may have attempted to negotiate a new arrangement, and Palliser killed him instead. Palliser, or someone working for him. Yes, that is what I believe. Holmes paused. The death itself, the drowning, was not, I think, an impulsive act. The timing, 2 weeks after the contact, suggests a period of deliberation. Palliser is a methodical man. He would have considered whether Hartley was a risk, whether he could be managed, and concluded that he could not. 2 years had given Hartley time to document things, to develop grievances, to become unpredictable. And then he was put in the river. Yes, Nora Hartley sat with this for a moment. Her hands were folded in her lap, still in the way they had been in every meeting we had had with her. There was no dramatic response, no weeping, no anger expressed outwardly. There was simply the look of a woman absorbing the full shape of something she had partly known and is now seeing completely. He was a weak man, she said finally. Not cruel, not wicked by nature, just weak in the particular way that makes a man do the wrong thing when the wrong thing is convenient and the right thing requires courage. He doesn't have. He got himself into something he couldn't manage and couldn't get out of, and eventually it killed him. She paused. I am sorry for him, which surprises me, but there it is. Holmes said nothing to this, which was the right response. Holmes had, in the days since the visit to Mayfair, been constructing 2 things simultaneously: the factual case against Palliser and a separate investigation into the breadth of the operation. The latter yielded, by the end of the 2nd week, a picture considerably larger and more organized than the Palliser estate alone had suggested. There were 4 other estates where Holmes identified the same pattern of diversion, the same structure of transfers, the same category of beneficiaries receiving less than the will intended, the same absence of any obvious point of complaint because the mechanism was too subtle for ordinary review to detect. 3 other solicitors had been involved, in addition to Hartley. One had retired in 1893 and died a year later. One was still practicing. One had emigrated to Canada in 1895 under circumstances that bore, on examination, some similarity to Hartley's departure, though no fake death had been involved. The living solicitor, a man named Croft, who practiced in Hammersmith, was the key. Holmes had not contacted him directly, but had established enough of the pattern to present Lestrade with a complete picture of the operation, who the principals were, what the mechanism was, what the documentation showed, and where the remaining evidence could be found. Lestrade, to his credit, moved quickly once the full structure was explained to him. The arrest of Edmund Palliser on charges of fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and as an accessory to the death of Gerald Hartley, was made on a Thursday morning. Holmes was not present. He had given Lestrade everything needed and declined, as he sometimes did when the outcome was already determined, to attend the procedural formalities. What Palliser did not know, what became clear only after the arrest, during the subsequent police search of his business records, was that Gerald Hartley had, in his 10 months living under a false name in Southwark, done something remarkable. He had written it down. Not a confession, exactly, more a complete account. A detailed, methodical reconstruction of everything he had done as part of the operation, beginning with the first approach from Palliser in 1892 and continuing through the preparation for his disappearance and the reasons behind it. He had written it in a small leather-bound notebook that he had left with a Southwark solicitor, a different solicitor, an honest one, a man who had never heard of Palliser and had simply been asked to hold an envelope and release it to the Metropolitan Police if his client ceased to call in on the first Thursday of each month. Hartley had last called in on the first Thursday of July. By the first Thursday of August, he was in the Thames. The notebook reached Scotland Yard 1 week before Holmes concluded his investigation, which meant that when Holmes walked into Lestrade's office with his files, Lestrade was already in possession of a corroborating account that covered the first half of the case from the inside. Holmes read the notebook in Lestrade's office. I watched him read it. When he finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He planned this before he came back to England, Holmes said. He knew, when he decided to return, that he was taking a risk. He knew Palliser was still out there. He knew that if Palliser found him, or if he tried to resume contact, the outcome was likely not to be peaceful. He came back anyway, because whatever the reasons, he couldn't stay away. And he left the notebook because some part of him understood that his best protection against being disappeared twice was to ensure that what he knew was in the hands of someone who would release it, whether he was alive to instruct them. Not a dead man's testament, I said. Yes, he took the precaution a dead man could take. Holmes set the notebook down carefully on Lestrade's desk. In the end, for whatever it is worth, he tried to do the right thing. 18 months too late and at the wrong end of his life, but he tried. The trial of Edmund Palliser lasted 11 days and produced enough evidence of organized fraud across 6 estates to occupy the prosecution with material they found more than adequate. The charge connected to Hartley's death was the hardest to prove, as it required establishing a chain of causation through intermediaries rather than Palliser's direct action. Holmes testified for 2 days, and his testimony was as thorough and precise as anything I have seen him deliver in a long career of court appearances. Palliser was convicted. The sentences were substantial. The surviving solicitor, Croft, received a lesser sentence after cooperating with the prosecution's case and providing the inside account of the mechanism that the notebook corroborated. Clara Palliser, who had known something was wrong with her father's estate since 1894 and had never been able to articulate it clearly enough for anyone to act, received a partial recovery of what had been diverted. It was not the full amount, but it was something, and it was accompanied by a public acknowledgement of the fraud that she had. She told Holmes in a brief letter she sent after the trial, been waiting 2 years to see. Nora Hartley attended every day of the trial. She sat in the public gallery with the same upright, contained composure she had brought to every encounter in this case, and she listened to every piece of evidence with the attention of a woman who is making sure she misses nothing. On the last day, when the verdict was read, she simply nodded, as though confirming something she had been waiting to have confirmed. She returned to Dorset afterward. Holmes received one letter from her, some months later, which he showed to me. It said, among other things, I came to Scotland Yard because I saw something that made no sense, and I had no tolerance for things that made no sense. That is simply my nature, and it has caused me a good deal of trouble over the years, but I cannot see much point in apologizing for it. What I did not expect was to find out, over the course of a month, that the sensible life I had been living for the past 2 years was built on a set of facts I had chosen not to examine closely. That is a disconcerting thing to discover about oneself. I have been thinking about it since. I have decided that it was not cowardice, exactly, that made me not look closely. It was a kind of bargain I made without admitting I was making it. I don't know if that is better or worse than cowardice. Perhaps it is simply human, and the question of whether it is better or worse is not one that resolves neatly. What I am certain of is that I am glad I went to Scotland Yard, and I am glad the constable there was bad enough at his job to leave the door open while I was waiting. Some strokes of accidental fortune should be acknowledged. Holmes folded the letter and placed it in his desk. He said nothing for a moment, and then, "The most useful thing Nora Hartley did in this entire case was ask the question that everyone else had decided not to ask." Which question? The question of which death was real. He settled back in his armchair. Most people, presented with the information that their husband had been confirmed dead for 2 years, and presented subsequently with a body that resembled him, would find a way to reconcile the two facts without disturbing the first one. The comfortable explanation was available. She was wrong in Southwark. Grief was playing tricks. The resemblance was coincidental. She declined that explanation. Not because she was trained to decline it, not because she had any reason to suppose the first death had been staged. Simply because she was the kind of person who cannot accept a fact that doesn't cohere, even when accepting it would be much more convenient. You admire her for it. I find it, as I have found few things in the people I encounter professionally, genuinely admirable. Not the bravery of the extraordinary moment anyone can find courage in an emergency, but the bravery of the ordinary one, the decision, on a Tuesday morning in a drab waiting room, to insist on being right about something that everyone around you is trying to convince you you're wrong about. That, he said, and picked up his pipe, takes a particular kind of character. I have called this case, in my own records, by the name Nora Hartley gave it when she first described it to the constable at Scotland Yard, the story of the husband who died twice. It is, I think, the right name, because it preserves the quality of the original claim, the precise, calm insistence on a logical impossibility, delivered by a woman who had correctly identified that the impossibility was real, and that the only response to a real impossibility is to follow it wherever it goes. Holmes has said, more than once in our years together, that the fundamental error of most investigations is the premature imposition of a plausible explanation on facts that do not yet warrant one. The people at Scotland Yard, and the coroner of 1894, and the men who settled Palliser's fraudulent estate accounts, had all made this error. They had looked at a configuration of facts and found the plausible explanation and stopped looking. They had arrived at what they expected to find, rather than what was there. Nora Hartley looked at the body in the Southwark mortuary and found what was there. 2 scars, identical, on 2 different bodies. The plausible explanation that she was confused, that grief was distorting her perception, was available and comfortable. She declined it. Not because she had the training or the method to know what the right explanation was, but simply because she had an accurate enough relationship with her own certainty to trust it when it conflicted with the available comfort. Gerald Hartley, in the end, had done something similar, from the other direction, and far too late. And with the knowledge that it might cost him his life, he had written the truth down and arranged for it to outlast him. It did not save him, but it helped ensure that what he had been part of was, finally, made visible. The man in the grave at Wareham was identified, after the case was closed, through the records of the missing persons from 1894. His name was attached formally to the grave, and the grave marker was changed. This was a small thing, and it did not undo what had been done to him. But Holmes had insisted on it, in a quiet conversation with Lestrade that I was told about afterward, and the insistence was, I thought, characteristic. Even the peripheral dead, in Holmes's accounting, deserved their names. The autumn in which this case concluded was one of the cooler ones in my memory of London, the fog setting in early, the evenings shortening with what felt like unusual speed. Holmes, in the weeks after the trial, was in one of his quieter moods, reading, playing pieces of Brahms at odd hours, occasionally setting chemical experiments on the side table, and watching them with the detached attention of a man keeping himself occupied while his mind is elsewhere. I asked him once, during one of those evenings, what he was thinking about. "A man," he said, "who came back to England because he couldn't stay away, and left a notebook with a solicitor because he was afraid he wouldn't survive the return, and was right about the second part, and perhaps necessary about the first." He turned a page of the chemistry text in his lap without reading it. He was not a good man, Watson, in any meaningful sense. But he was not entirely what the facts of his career make him look like either. He was a man who made bad choices for comprehensible reasons and spent 2 years trying to figure out how to live with them, and eventually decided the only thing he could still do was leave a record. Is that enough? Holmes considered this for a moment. "It is rarely enough," he said, "but it is not nothing, and not nothing, in the cases where that is all that is available, tends to matter more than we give it credit for." The fire settled. The fog pressed against the windows. Outside, London continued in its vast, uninterrupted way, carrying everything forward. There are details that belong to a case without belonging cleanly to any single chapter of it, and the detail of how Gerald Hartley came to be in the Thames is one of those. I set it down here, outside the main sequence, because it arrived in pieces and assembled itself gradually over the final days of the investigation, and because the assembled picture has stayed with me in a particular way. Holmes established the reconstruction through a combination of sources: the notebook, which covered Hartley's own account up to the point of his return to England, witness statements gathered by Lestrade's men from the Southwark area, and a conversation with a woman who had lived next door to Hartley's lodgings and had paid closer attention to her neighbour's comings and goings than he had probably realized. The conversation with Palliser, whichever of the two men initiated it, had apparently taken the form, at least initially, of a negotiation. Hartley had wanted money. He had not, apparently, made threats in any direct sense, but the implicit threat of his existence was sufficient. A man who knew everything about the operation, who had faked his own death partly to escape it, and who was now back in England and demonstrably alive, was a problem that did not resolve itself. Palliser had agreed, initially, to terms. 2 meetings took place. Holmes had established this in public places, conducted with the outward appearance of perfectly ordinary encounters between 2 men of similar age. Money had been passed, apparently. Not enough, or not regularly enough, or perhaps simply in a manner that Palliser found increasingly untenable. The 3rd meeting had taken place near the river. The woman from next door had noticed that Hartley had dressed carefully that evening. She had seen him through the window, and she had thought at the time that he looked like a man going to do something important. He had been calmer than he had seemed in the preceding days, which she had attributed to him simply feeling better. Holmes attributed it to something else, the particular calm that comes to a person who has made a decision and committed to it. Hartley had left the notebook with the Southwark solicitor the week before. He had done what he could do. He had dressed carefully and gone to meet a man who had, almost certainly, already decided how the meeting would end. Whether Hartley knew this, Holmes could not determine. He may have known and gone anyway, with the same quality of resolution that had brought him back to England in the first place. He may have hoped the negotiation would hold, and been wrong. What Holmes could determine was that Hartley had not struggled, or if he had, not in a way that left evidence on his body beyond what the river had done. This suggested either that he had been incapacitated before reaching the water, or that he had not had the opportunity or the will to resist. Holmes thought the former more likely, and that the incapacitation had been quick and quiet, in the manner of someone who had studied the problem in advance. The body had been in the river for approximately 3 days before it was recovered. It had been found near London Bridge, not by chance, but because the currents at that point in the Thames are such that anything entering the water upstream will tend to fetch up there, and this tendency is known to anyone who has paid attention to how the river works. Palliser had paid attention. The card in Hartley's pocket, the card with Nora Hartley's name and Dorset address, was the one piece of the picture that I could not entirely account for through any of the obvious explanations. Holmes had thought about it and offered, characteristically, two possible interpretations between which he declined to choose definitively. The first, Hartley had carried the card himself, perhaps as a last connection to the life he had abandoned, and its discovery by the police was coincidental rather than intended. The second, the card had been placed there deliberately, by Hartley, before the meeting, in the knowledge that if he did not survive it, the card would bring the police to his widow, and his widow would identify him, and his re-identification would set in motion exactly what it had set in motion. That the man who had once staged his own death to avoid consequences had, at the end, stage-managed his real one to produce them. I found the second interpretation almost impossible to fully believe, and completely impossible to dismiss. It was, as Holmes said when I told him this, the kind of thought that deserves to sit in an unresolved place in the mind, rather than being forced into a conclusion. Some things cannot be known. What can be known is that Nora Hartley saw the card, and came to the mortuary, and recognized the scar, and went to Scotland Yard, and refused to be told she was confused, and that the rest followed from that. I want to record, before I close this account, something that Holmes said on the evening after Palliser's conviction, which I have not included in the main narrative, because it does not fit cleanly into the sequence, and because it is, in some sense, more about Holmes than about the case. We were at Baker Street. The evening was quiet. Holmes had been unusually still for most of the day, not the stillness of inertia, but the stillness of a man who has finished something and is taking a moment before moving on to the next thing. He was looking at the fire, and I was reading, and neither of us had spoken for perhaps 20 minutes. He said, "Do you know what troubles me most about this case, Watson?" I set my book down. "Not what was done. What was done is clear enough, and the consequences have followed appropriately enough. What troubles me is the system that made it possible not in the criminal sense, but in the structural one." He turned his pipe over in his hand. Gerald Hartley administered other people's trusts for years, and nobody had reason to look closely, until the discrepancy was so extreme that a clever woman noticed the silence where her father's money should have been. The mechanism relied entirely on the assumption that no one would check, and that assumption was correct for years. That is not a failure of one man's character. That is a structural vulnerability in a system that places enormous trust in individual solicitors and provides very little oversight of whether that trust is warranted. You think the law needs to change? I think the law, in this area, as in others, has not kept pace with the sophistication of the people working within it. But I am not a legislator, and the observation is above my professional grade, as I have said before about other things. He was quiet for a moment. What I am is a detective, and what I notice is that this case was solved not by institutional machinery, but by a woman who refused to accept an impossibility at face value. If she had been more easily discouraged, if Scotland Yard had been more dismissive, or if she had been less determined, the case would not have been opened. The notebook would eventually have reached the police through the solicitor's mechanism, but by then Palliser would have had weeks to move assets and cover traces. The window was narrow. You think we were fortunate? I think we were fortunate that Nora Hartley is who she is. Yes, he set the pipe down. I try not to rely on fortune in investigations, but I have learned, over the years, that the cases that matter most are frequently the ones that almost didn't happen, that almost weren't investigated, because the right person almost didn't ask the right question at the right moment. This was one of those cases, and the right person was not me. I found the answer. She found the question. He picked up his violin and drew the bow across the strings in a single, sustained note. Then he began to play something slow and deliberate that I didn't recognize, and when I asked him afterward what it was, he said he had made it up on the spot, which I believed because it had that quality. The quality of something being worked out as it goes, finding its shape in the making of it. Outside, London did what London always does, kept going, indifferently and enormously, carrying everything with it. Inside, the fire burned low, and the music continued, and the evening settled into the particular piece of a case that has reached its conclusion and left, in the way all the honest cases do, a residue of questions that no verdict can fully answer.